Welcome to Cultivate the Ordinary podcast, curious conversations for the anxious, frustrated, dejected, and bored. I'm Travis.
And I'm Jessie. So often we're held captive by screens, schedules, and media that's mind-numbing and polarizing. This leaves us seeing dimly through a fog. We want to spark more imagination and a better awareness of God's presence in the everyday.
Join us on a fun journey of discovery and curiosity as we look at the ordinary through the lenses of joy, wonder, beauty, and hope. Welcome to the podcast today. Really excited to tackle this topic. It's a big one. It's full of stories. It's full of miracles. It's full of God's presence. And I'm getting to do it with my brother, Dan. And so what we're going to talk about is the car accident from 2009 that completely changed the trajectory of our family. It was full of suffering. It was full of all kinds of twists and turns. And a big feature of it is about Jeremy, what he's went through with a traumatic brain injury, his road to recovery. But two of my other brothers were also in the car wreck as well. And Dan had a significant role in both what he experienced and how he experienced God through that. And his story is very intertwined with Jeremy's. And so that's kind of the setup of what this episode is about. Dan is an incredible storyteller. So you're going to hear that in this. He was a youth pastor, has been a pastor. He's in seminary now. And he'll tell more about kind of what he's doing and about his life and family. But yeah, looking forward to this, walking through this together. And Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah,
and
thanks for having me on, Trav.
Yes,
so
sir.
good. This is my first podcast, so I'm kind of nervous here. But no, I'm super stoked that you and Jesse started this. It's I've listened to some of the episodes, and they're just engaging. They're creative. Thought-provoking, funny. I mean, just all the above. So, yeah, man, I just hope our conversation today can keep the momentum going. But just look forward to see how God's going to use this podcast.
Awesome, man. Well, so you're in seminary now, correct? And so what is kind of your kind of vision for your future? And then tell us a little bit about your own family and stuff.
Yeah. So, like Trav said, have been in pastoral roles prior to my seminary journey. Yeah, so right now it's graduate school at seminary. I'm going to Reformed Theological Seminary up in Charlotte and pursuing the Master's of Divinity. So I am deep entrenched in the books and Greek and all the above. So I'm having to really just give a lot of my time and focus into the study. It's been incredible. I've loved the journey. Just being able to sit under professors that through their experience and all that they have to bring, the wisdom has been amazing. I'm surrounded in some of my classes from people all over the world. Guy in front of me from Germany, have a friend from India, people from Africa. So God has really drawn the nations to the classes that I'm a part of in seminary. So I'm being challenged and stretched in new ways that I never had been before. We have four kids, 10, 8, 4, and 3. So we have a lively household, just like you, and just trying to be a good dad, trying to enjoy life in these kind of crazy years, but they're so fun. It's such an adventure.
Awesome. Yeah. You guys have your hands full, but yeah, they have a awesome crew. And so our own family, Dan and I, the family that we're siblings in, we have, it's 5 of us dudes and then a sister whose Steph is probably the toughest of us all. Had to be.
Yep.
Where do you rank yourself as best looking among all the guys? I mean, do you have like a fair?
Well, of course, one. I mean, how do you? No, it is funny.
Middle of the pack, or are you?
Well, there are some that are glamorous looking than others, but
Oh, we're changing too.
years have been hard.
Time hasn't been good to some of us.
No, it is funny when I introduce a brother or something, and I'm around somebody who's never met, like let's say you or Ryan or Brett. Their first thing is like, you sound exactly the same. I mean, your voice and your mannerisms, and of course, I don't see it that way, but we'll let your listeners be the judge of who has the better voice, even maybe in this.
There will be. I feel like now you saying that's making me want to deepen my voice just to try to.
Well, I have a cold, so that's going to help here. But
Johnny Cash here, but well, yeah, we'll let the listeners decide. Yeah, cool. So I thought before we kind of go into starting to kind of now unpack the story and kind of everything around Jeremy, there's an old story that I think is it's funny and entertaining from our childhood that involves you and Jeremy. So Jeremy's the next, I guess, oldest after you, and then it goes Ryan, and then Brett. I forgot how many of us are there, and Steph's right after me. So, but anyway, Dan had loved, Native American culture. We were from North Dakota and all this, and that was a big, you just loved. Yeah. So you're playing.
Well, when your
Cowboys
parents don't give you video games, I mean, you got to get pretty creative on a farm. Yeah, I mean, it's a funny story that I think has just become legend now, especially with the little kids. All the cousins, they want to hear this story, but. Yeah, long story short, me and Jeremy were out on the farm and, bored to death, and hey, what should we do today? And let's just go play Cowboys and Indians. Well, it ended up being Indians versus Indians, I guess, rival war parties here, but we're both wearing loincloths, washcloths and belts. Yep, that's it. And I had this idea of creating this bow and arrow. So I'm in the woods. I get this tree branch, and I'm fashioning this bow and arrow. Found some good string. Anyways, I don't have an arrow to go with the bow, so I go into Dad's shop and I find one of his hunting arrows, and thinking that's going to be a good idea. Have that. So I'm in the woods. Jeremy's coming towards me, kind of doing his pounding his mouth, whatever. And I just pulled that string back and I just let it go, not thinking, it's going to go maybe 10 feet. That thing probably went 20 yards and it hit Jeremy square in the mouth. I mean, as his hand is coming down, that arrow right in the back of the throat, and it sticks in. And I'm still scarred to this day, stuck. Jeremy does a 180, runs back into the house screaming with an arrow in his mouth. About 15 minutes later, my dad, I could just hear him, opens the front door and hollering for my name, get back here. And I'm in there just like, I just killed my brother. So I break my bow and arrow and hide. And then, the longer I wait in the woods, the more spankings I probably got. But anyways, that's kind of the tall tale.
Oh my gosh, that's an epic story, and I'm picturing you then emerging back from the woods at whatever time you did, still like the shame of what happened, and then you're in a loincloth on top of that. How would you ever come back from that?
Yeah,
the fact you've become who you are,
right?
Despite all, yeah. So, wow.
I was naked and afraid. Just say that.
Okay, so. We're going to move now into the story and looking back at Jeremy's accident, Dan's accident, and our brother Ryan also was in that. Before that, and I may have said some of this, but so it happened in the summer of 2009. Dan will explain more, but basically to this day, Jeremy is what we would kind of say in a way trapped in his body. He suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. He needs 24/7 care, and he's in between a bed and a wheelchair. That's his daily existence. So that's kind of what left him. The accident completely changed the trajectory of his life. But as you're going to hear more in this podcast and throughout a theme of, if you know Jeremy, joy is probably the kind of almost the greatest thing that's apparent from his life. And I want to set up this whole story with a profound quote from the writer Frederick Buechner on joy, because I feel like the way he describes joy is the way you're going to hear Dan, well, really Jeremy and his way of seeing his life, the lens he sees it through. So here's Buechner. Joy is a mystery because it can happen anywhere, anytime, even under the most unpromising circumstances, even in the midst of suffering, with tears in its eyes. It's hard to not tell this story and see Jeremy's joy, but tell it with tears in your eyes and, and at times probably laughter and all that. Like, that's a beautiful way that I think he captures joy in a different way. So,
like kind of like Trav said, this is a story of suffering, of pain, of grief, of trial, of really, in some ways, it's a story of how our entire family has had to process and navigate very difficult things, things that happened 15 years ago that still hurt us today. There's still a lot of deep evoked emotions. And one of the ways I would say to kind of set up what we're going to talk about today was one of the lines that has stuck with me from an old pastor. One of kind of my mentor pastors, his name is Robert Smith Jr., an old African-American pastor, just faithful brother, expositor of the word, professor, seminary, at a seminary. But he said this, he said, when it comes to processing grief, he said, we can't take the elevator. We have to take the stairs. And I love that line because grief, it's long. You can't just hit a button, boom, you're there, you've arrived. It's a long process. And I would just say, kind of in that same metaphor, as a family, we haven't had to carry this burden of grief alone. Christ is in the stairwell with us as a family. He has been for the last 15 years walking with us up the stairs in this grief. Yeah. So, as we just kind of get to the story, here the story's Christ. And we have seen him shine in many, many ways. Yeah, and I would say one thing too, Trav, as we just set up the story and, as I've been even just looking back on the story and just kind of preparing for this podcast, a lot of emotions. Trav hit it right. Seeing Jeremy, it just emanates with joy. But both Trav and I and the rest of our family really processing a lot of grief. And I would know that, when you think of this story for our family, it was a watershed moment. I often find ourselves when we're just talking as brothers and sisters, going back and talking about past stories, they're either in two categories. They're either, was this before the accident or was this after the accident? And that just kind of shows how pivotal this story has been in the lives of all of our family and even to this day.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well said. It's a marker of our entire family's existence. So let's get into, before we set up sort of that fateful day in Montana, tell us a little about Jeremy going into, that summer or even before that. Like, who was Jeremy? What was, being close together and all that? Like, set us up with Jeremy.
Yeah, Jeremy was one of my best friends. He was the kindest, most compassionate guy that you could imagine. He was a fierce competitor. Jeremy was an All-American runner. Set records at college and high school. So he was a fierce athlete by every metric. One of the ways I would kind of quantify Jeremy is he's kind of what I call a 1-2 go guy. For me, I'm a little bit more calculated. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, go. Jeremy, 1, 2, I'm going. And that was just symbiotic of how much he loved life, how much he sought adventure. He had a deep, quiet inner strength, more than anybody I ever knew. And I think he got a lot of that from our dad. We'll talk about later. But Jeremy had just a quiet, deep contentment and just a deep power with within him that I always admired. I think Jeremy was often misunderstood by people because of his quietness, but he was, and all of this, as we'll see, really came to help him even where he is right now in life, of how he gets through every day. But if there's one quick story that I would say that just summarizes who Jeremy was. So the summer that we were out there in 2009, we took a group of us out to the Tetons. We went for a hike. It was a 14-mile hike in the Tetons. And I remember at the end of the hike, people are kind of coming in, we're tired, we're weary, the fire's going, and Jeremy's not here. He didn't arrive in camp. And the next thing we know, this is maybe an hour and a half after we had all set up camp. It's dark out, and we see two pairs or two headlamps off in the distance coming towards the camp. And it was Jeremy. Jeremy was with the last hiker to come to camp. She was a girl that had never hiked before. This was a Mount Everest for her. And here's Jeremy staying back with her to get her to the destination. And looking back on that, a lot of people didn't even appreciate. I mean, it's kind of, okay, we see them coming, great, she's fine. But had Jeremy not been attentive to her and had sought her out and helped her, we might have had to call search and rescue. But it was just a metaphor, I think, of who Jeremy was. He could have been easily the first guy to camp. I mean, there's, a bunch of guys hiking and whatever. There's an ego there. But I think for Jeremy to lay aside his own glory, to lay aside his own strength and prowess to really help serve this girl was, I think, just a symbol of who he was as a man.
Wow. Yeah. Well, so that's a great setup to kind of us all remembering, Jeremy before the accident. So, and kind of his character traits that were already there. And like you said, were going to then be part of him powering through what would happen next. So, he also, I remember looking back, last part of this, the setup is he wrote a letter that I wish I had it in front of me. We have it somewhere, but basically he said something sort of, it would almost be prophetic of, something like, I want God to use me however it will be. I'm probably botching it a little bit, but basically like whatever comes, that's what I want.
Yeah.
Not like I want God to, anyway, I mean, we could just, but so Dan, take us now into, sort of, and I know this could be episodes of that day, but the accident, but we're going to try to do it in more of a snapshot, kind of a summary type of moments of what transpired.
Yeah. So I think just to reorient ourselves here to the story, let's go back to Glacier National Park. This is the summer of 2009. Four of us, myself, Jeremy, our brother Ryan, and then our friend Scott. We all found ourselves at midnight on the Highline Trail in Glacier National Park. The next day, we were going to come back to West Yellowstone, where we were, it's kind of our home base for our ministry that summer. And I just remember looking out over the valley, all four of us, and the conversation that we had was, what would heaven be like? And little did we know that the next day, heaven would be a very near reality. And again, we're in our 20s. All of life is before us. And just we're so young, and to think that the next day would be a day that we will never forget, and a day that would change our lives forever. We got on the road the next morning, and we were heading back to Bozeman. That was our final destination for lunch, and then on to West Yellowstone. And we stopped at a Native American reservation in Browning, Montana. We all switched places. Scott became the driver. Ryan was in the front seat. Jeremy and I were in the back seat. And we're going down the road. It was a long stretch of highway. We think the air conditioning went out, and Jeremy and I had just taken our seatbelts off in the back seat. Ryan was in the front reading a Bob Dylan book, and Scott was driving. And we don't know exactly what happened, but we believe that Scott just fell asleep at the wheel. And I just remember being in the back seat, kind of half between sleep, half being awake, and just hearing the hum of the highway. And then the next kind of sequence of events was something I'll never forget. Hearing the rough bump of the ground let me know that we are off of the highway. And I remember jarring myself up and then seeing us drive through a big highway sign. And the next thing I knew, we're just catapulting across the highway on I-90. And it's interesting how your brain processes these things, because this would have been just mere seconds, but it seemed like an absolute eternity. The sound of that accident is something that still haunts me to this day. I'll never forget the just how ear-deafening, just hearing metal crunching as we're just flying across the highway. In that split-second moment, I realized I'm not wearing a seatbelt. And the next thing I know, I'm flying airborne through the air. And whether I went out through the windshield or whether I went out through the side window, I don't know. But all I do know is I'm flying through the air. And I've often framed it like this. Imagine landing on a treadmill of concrete. That's what it was like. That was the sensation of flying, and then you're hitting pavement and you're not stopping. I finally came to a halt, and it's interesting, and I'll share this, but I never blacked out this entire duration of time. And I feel like it is because the Lord wanted me to remember and recall some of these events, and then to even share it now. But I remember basically stopping. I'm on the white line of a highway, realizing as things are happening, this is 3 p.m, it's hot. You can hear the buzz of the highway in the other direction, and your mind just snaps into action. I've got to get off this road. Well, as I'm pulling myself, I'm just realizing I'm not going anywhere. And I essentially just turn over on my back, and I'm just like, this is it. I'm going to die in the middle of nowhere, far from my family, and this is it. I remember in that moment feeling a loneliness like I've never felt in my life. Again, you're surrounded kind of by prairie. Where am I? What am I doing? What just happened? And just feeling absolutely isolated and alone. Well, it wasn't long after that God sent some miracles to this day that I'll never forget. One such thing that I remember seeing lying there was an image of Christ in the sky, and hard to summarize what that was, but it was in essence an image of Christ, the thorns, suffering. And I knew in that moment that Christ was suffering with me. It didn't fix me, but it gave me a hope that I never had. And I did not feel alone like I did before. It wasn't long after that Ryan came running towards me on the highway. And I just remember asking him, "Where's Jeremy?" And I just remember Ryan running to the other side of the Jeep. Jeremy was also ejected from the vehicle. He was laying in the fetal position, kind of blood trickling down the side of his mouth, and just Ryan coming back. And I just remember looking at him, hands are in the air, and he's just going, "Oh God, oh God, oh God." And you know, it's a lot to think about even today, that any of us are here, but Scott was inside. He was pinned. Passerbys are now coming by at the scene, and they're trying to help, and they had to drag me off to the side of the highway. And unlike maybe what you think in movies, you have the accident and you're just, next thing you're in the hospital. And I had a highway patrolman come up to me and say, this is going to be a long wait. There's been 2 other accidents. You're just going to have to wait. And and at that point, I still was not feeling pain. I think there's just so much adrenaline surging through my veins. But I do remember getting the courage up just to look down at my body, and it was pretty brutal. I had a lot of road burn, a lot of injuries. I know the highway patrolman said he thought I had broke my femur, and that was just because I had actually dislocated my knee. So it looked as if, I was in bad shape. We were all fighting for our lives, most literally.
Wow.
Looking back, Trav, just at the force of that accident. I mean, the scene on that highway at mile marker 294, it just seemed apocalyptic. All of our gear was just strewn across the highway, blood splattered. This will give you an idea of just the force of kind of some of the carnage of the accident. One of us had a MacBook computer, and its keyboard was peeled back like an orange peel. I mean, we had shirts that had holes in them. I mean, it was just that there was that much force involved, and that just goes to show again just the hand of God that any of us even survived. Now at that point, Jeremy was, like I said, completely unconscious. The next day, the Bozeman Chronicle printed an article, front page, that said 1 killed in I-90 crash, referring to Jeremy. But God sent another miracle his way. He was a doctor. There was a doctor that, his name was Dr. Frank, who specialized in air resuscitation. He was a ER doctor, and quote unquote, just so happened to be behind our vehicle. Him and his wife were vacationing from Michigan, and there he is breathing air into Jeremy's lungs, right there on the highway. So at this juncture, Scott and Jeremy were both taken to the Bozeman Hospital, and then finally I had my time to leave after maybe 45 minutes to an hour of being on the highway. Finally getting to the hospital, and I was able to go back and visit the same hospital a couple years later, and I talked to one of the surgeons who had happened to be there, and he just said that day was absolutely chaotic. There were multiple accidents that day. Names were getting confused, who's who, and I remember him saying, we had to identify you guys differently and separate you, from the accident, so we called you the Missionary Four. And, maybe a more proper name would have been the Miracle Four, because each of us were laying on beds separated by blue curtains. And I just remember that surgeon saying it was a very, very chaotic, dire situation. And then eventually Jeremy was air flighted to Billings, Montana. And we'll talk a little bit about more of his recovery.
So, kind of sharing a little bit of my experience of what happened next. So I'm in St. Louis. Jess and I are in St. Louis, and I get that, that phone call, you sort of sometimes imaginatively maybe dread or think like, what if one day I get that call of, some catastrophe? And I remember my brother-in-law, Jeff, calling, and basically it was just, I was out mowing, the grass, and it was just like, Trav, he's like, Dan and Jeremy and Ryan were in a wreck. Dan and Jeremy may not make it. It's sort of that's all we knew. And then you can imagine what the rest of the night would have looked like. I actually looked back, and so then from there on, at least from my end of things, it sounded like, okay, the little report that we got was that, Dan had suffered catastrophic, wounds and injuries from his thing, and then Jeremy had suffered a devastating traumatic brain injury. And the prognosis initially, just even that night, was basically there was confusion around like Jeremy is basically, I understood it that we were told like was going to Billings to basically donate his organs. I mean, he's medically alive, but that's basically it. Well, in preparation for this podcast, I looked back at, actually we have the trauma surgeon notes from him coming into the table. I mean, off the ambulance or whatever, or the jet flight. And basically he said it was a diffuse axonal shearing injury, one of the worst kind of brain injuries there are, because it's basically the connections of your brain just getting sheared by the inertia of like a rollover wreck. The trauma surgeon suspected brain death within 24 to 48 hours. Another treating surgeon said he's actually very close to brain death. So we go to bed that night basically being told he's essentially dead. I mean, and so I remember the grief and just like, we've lost our brother Jeremy. I don't know what, but a bit of confusion. And then then the next morning, I just remember like, still, I just had this unsettled, what is the state? So I remember calling the hospital, and they basically were like, well, he's not. I mean, he's vegetative. We don't, it's extremely dire still. We don't know that he's going to be anything from that, but he's still alive technically. So I'm going to bounce it back to you. But at that point, then the way I understood it is mom and dad had the choice. Your two sons are in ICUs. How far is Billings from Bozeman?
Couple hours.
Hours. So your two sons are in two ICUs fighting for their life. Your parents, picture being parents, which ICU do you go? Do you split up? Do you pick one? Mom and dad ultimately made the decision to with Jeremy's prognosis, probably thinking that being with you was more crucial to help you pull through, right? So I'm going to bounce it back to you on because you were in awful shape.
Yeah. So, for me, here I am now, I waking up to blinking lights, to unfamiliar smells and faces, and just kind of thinking, where am I? And then as reality just kind of sets in, you're thinking, wow, this wasn't a dream. This is real. As you feel some surges of pain here and there in my body. And so at that point, the only people at the hospital at that point at my bedside were my two uncles, Bruce and Mike, who had come all the way from North Dakota to see me. So I'm kind of looking at their silhouette in a dark room, and I had sustained several injuries, external injuries to my body, all of which were relayed to me through mom and dad when they eventually got there. One of our brothers tells a story, I think it was Brett, who said, when dad got off the elevator at Bozeman Deaconess Hospital, in one hand he has a bag and some supplies, and he's in the other is mom's hand, and he's wearing his John Deere hat. I mean, getting off the elevator, and it's just so symbolic of dad, ready to get to work, ready to face the next mountain, ready to fight adversity, because our dad, that was just his life. So much adversity, so many uphill battles, and here's another one of two of his sons essentially on the verge of death. So one of the surgeons told mom that your son is gonna have to relearn to walk. He had a posterior dislocation of his left knee, which which means that statistically 85% of people with that injury will have an amputated leg. Road rash. I wasn't wearing shoes at the time, so the surgeons kind of believe that, based on my injuries, I kind of landed on my feet. So, being thrown through the air, landing on your feet, well, then you're not wearing shoes on a cement, pavement, whatever. And then I essentially kind of did like the splits. I mean, that's the one way they framed it. So I had an extensive injury that required me to have a colostomy. They had to reroute my colon, all these types of things. I had to have a wound vac. And he said, the wound is something like kind of equivalent to something you see on a battlefield. I can stick my fist in it. It's like, if you're praying people, you need to be praying, because, this is there could be the potential for a lot of infection. So I'm covered in head to toe with bandages, and these were long, hard days in the hospital. Having to be pulled up every morning to put my feet on the ground, and then to just put one step after the other and try to walk, was just, I remember spending my 24th birthday in the Bozeman Deaconess Hospital, and that was a couple days, after the accident. I remember sitting out in the lobby with, some family, and there's cake, and I'm just, how am I going to get through this? And then in the back of my mind, how's Jeremy doing? How's Scott doing? How's Ryan, who didn't have any injuries, but he had the internal trauma of just like all the things he witnessed and saw, like, how was he doing? And I just remember, just seeing glimmers of like gospel help. There were some old couples from some of the churches in Bozeman that would come and visit me, complete strangers, just sitting in my room, telling me stories. I remember one of the guys, he was an old rancher, Montana rancher, Dennis Goulet. He said, trying to help me, and he's like, Dan, let me tell you a story when I broke my pelvis. And then you're thinking, oh gosh, this is helpful. But he said, he had a bad break. He was, anyways, and he had relearned to walk. And he said that when the physical therapist would say, walk 10 steps, I'd always walk one more. And they said, why did you do that? I said, I walked 10 for you. I walked one for Jesus. Wow. And again, this is just an old faithful guy who had no business being there, other than he just wants to encourage me. We had one of the other miracles that was huge in the story, pivotal, was, as family were arriving at the hospital, there was no place to stay except the waiting room. And a lady by the name of Vicki Hutchins, who lived in Bozeman at the time, a friend had called her and said, you need to go to the hospital. There were 3 boys from Cowpens, South Carolina, that were in an accident. Well, Vicki grew up in Cowpens. And so she comes, and she is the most hospitable. She's saying to the family, come, you can stay at my house. They live in a beautiful ranch right out there in the mountains. So as the family is just navigating grief, they're able to find respite in just God's creation. I mean, a lot of little glimmers of gospel hope that that just got us all through.
Let me just real quick add on to that from as well. Exactly. Feeling the same thing. So a contingent of us went to Billings. So Jess and I then, knowing Mom and Dad were going to Bozeman for Dan, we flew out, I think maybe the next morning or the following morning, to Billings to be with Jeremy. And I think maybe our uncles also then headed to Billings. So we kind of almost had 2 camps, 2 ICUs getting some love. And anyway, so we were then with Jeremy over there. And I remember, to kind of what you're saying, is that there seemed to be some stories that I was hearing about just people that had recovered from brain injuries. Like in discussions, like I remember being in the hallway, or my mom would come back and share, like, she just met someone and so was in this dire brain injury situation, and they recovered miraculously. And I think I heard about 2 or 3 of those stories in this short time period. And I remember my emotion was thinking, okay, either that is a wink of God, like hope, like have hope hanging. I've actually providentially placed these people to encourage you. That was a thought. Or, but I remember this sinking feeling. If Jeremy never recovers, never pulls out of this, dies, whatever, that was the most, I didn't know how I could square my faith with God of like, why would we be put into those moments to hear that? And then maybe Jeremy's lost. And I felt like I was already preempting thinking like, I don't know how to reconcile if that happens. But that was an emotion when you said like the hope, but I remember, yeah.
Yeah, wow. And Trav and I will share here just as we go down the timeline and the narrative, so many other glimmers of these hope things that only came from the Lord. You know, my ticket out of the hospital was eventually they would have to do an operation where I wouldn't require the use of anesthesia. And I had 13 operations. I was sedated that many times. And I just remember the surgeon basically saying, you know, your ticket out of here is we're going to have to change the dressings, and this is really going to be painful for you, but it's going to be what we have to do to get you to get out, essentially. And, you know, of course he tells me that at like 8:30 in the morning. So then, you know, you have all day to kind of marinate on that. But one of the nurses, had many of them, but one of the nurses who had listened to that was not a believer. She went out and had a plaque made for me. And she went to the operating room, and before the surgery, she actually taped it above the ceiling that would be in view of my eyes as I'm looking up. And the plaque was Psalm 91. And again, not a believer, but just knew that this would encourage me. So as I'm getting tugged on and prodded and all these things, I'm looking at Psalm 91 and just feeling a sense of nearness to God like I'd never have felt before, but a nearness, but just so much pain, so much hurt. And come to find out years later that this nurse eventually came to faith and recently passed away not long ago. But again, only God could script some of these things. And, you know, they stopped the operation, and eventually I had to get sedated again. But, you know, the finish line was near for me. And at that point, Dad was with me, and had a couple more days at the hospital. And I remember getting on an elevator, and I always share this story because this was a conversation that I had with a person that changed my life. Me and Dad get on an elevator at the hospital, and also at the same floor, another guy gets on in a business suit, has a briefcase, and he looks at me, and he says, "So what happened to you?" In a just very gruff tone, and I'm holding a wound vac. I have a chest plate on, a neck plate on, my legs are completely braced out, and I have a cane. And I said I was in a car accident. And he looks at me and he says, "Were you wearing a seatbelt?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, I hope you've had a long time to think about that." Elevator dings, he gets off. And that was a brutal moment because, you know, absolute despair kicked in, because this whole time in my mind, I'd been playing this game of the what if game. What if we never would have went to Glacier? What if I was driving? What if we never would have come out here? It got so bad that it got to the point of what if I was never born? And just haunting me, you know, because you have all day to think about these things. But something that God used in this conversation was, it showed me that, no, God was in control of this chaos. God had a purpose. God had a reason for the suffering that I couldn't really see, but he was going to use it for good. And, you know, with time comes clarity. And, you know, it's been almost 15 years now since the accident. I just had this memory hit me just the other day in my hospital room in the ICU. people would come in and their first thing would be like, wow, it's beautiful, because in the view of the room was the mountains. And they would always comment on how beautiful the mountains were. And my thing is, I could never see them because my bed was not positioned. I was always looking at the door. But I think the kind of the beautiful thing, the metaphor there was, I couldn't see the beauty. Other people could, but the backdrop was just the stunning display that I couldn't see at the time. And I think it just goes to show, like, God was putting together this mosaic. He was putting together this story, and much of it hinged upon Jeremy and his recovery and his joy. But again, it's just a glimmer of, in the darkest moments of despair, there was hope on the horizon.
Wow. Yeah, it's amazing too that, like you said, that thought just hits you 15 years later, thinking back, imagining that scene. Wow. So kind of, again, we're kind of chronologically walking the story and, kind of moments of God's presence and providence and miracles and things like that. So at this point, there's really a trajectory here of two stories. It's you and Jeremy, and both your recoveries kind of going in different directions. You continually getting better in a way, slow, but Jeremy just a mystery, because he would have technically, I don't know how long you technically count that you're in a coma, but still basically unresponsive. But he's stable enough to where he then gets flown home to Spartanburg. I know at the time he did not qualify for showing any of the signs that he was up to the level of like a big, I don't know what you even call it now, but a coma recovery center or whatever, like in Atlanta or Charlotte. At that point, I remember that was devastating, of like, because you're thinking, man, I mean, maybe they have all the tricks and the tools and the technology to help get him more recovered. I mean, basically, you're still completely non-responsive, but just living, right? So he comes back to Spartanburg, and he's in some sort of at least a rehab, at least to where I don't even remember the things that they were doing there for him, but it definitely wasn't some kind of brain injury, kind of extensive recovery program. Well, taking the lead probably from our dad, but also just, growing up on the farm, and you just kind of like, I feel like we just had this sense like we're just going to take matters into our own hands. And I'm wired like that anyway, probably, but I remember doing some research it was a coma treatment program I think I saw online. Like, it was basically their playbook. And I learned enough of little things of like the things that they would do. Like, you would work on sensory touching. You would maybe have a mirror that you're tracking across his face. A phone, familiar things, but sensory, hearing, auditory, all these things that you're kind of trying to spark his brain to kind of like wake up, like and so we just like, dude, we like almost was like we wrote our program, like me and brothers and friends in Spartanburg were like, let's just do this. And I remember it was like, so we have video of like people like tracking with a mirror across Jeremy's face or rubbing his hands with stuff. And I'm telling you, it was like, I don't know again the timeline here, but he starts moving his head. He's tracking, he's hearing sounds. And part of me thinks, I mean, again, this is God's working, but it was with the proximity of people he knew. And maybe that's a big part of like brain injury recovery, is like familiarity. And maybe Jeremy was there's a horror of me looking back to this going like, because I've heard stories of this where people can be comatose, can be what appears to be non-responsive, and they're literally trapped in their body. And maybe what if Jeremy was, and he was actually more aware than we knew, and people are talking about all these dire prognosis, and there's a Twilight Zone episode about that, where it's like, they're going to bury this guy in the grave as he's gone, and the only way he can communicate is a tear drops down, and then they see the tear, and they like, so anyway, that's our experience with Jeremy in Spartanburg. You're still in Montana.
Yeah. And I'll share this, I'm finally getting ready to fly home, and I just remember the last 2 weeks I spent with this couple on their ranch out in the mountains, and the whole time Dad is changing my dressings. He's there with me every step of the way, and it was time to head to the airport to fly. And I remember walking out, had my cane, all that kind of stuff, and my colostomy bag gets caught on the driver's side mirror, and it just rips off, and you can imagine all the stuff that's all over the place. And I just remember banging my cane on the ground, like just out of frustration, like I'm just so done. And I just remember Dad's calming presence, like, it's gonna be okay. It's gonna be okay, son. Let's just, and then who's cleaning it up? Dad. And we fly home, and we land in Atlanta, and at this point the family, and rightfully so, had shielded me a little bit of how bad Jeremy was condition wise. And, I had to do my own recovery. So there's no hard feelings, but, I knew it was bad. I just didn't know how bad. And the first thing I wanted to do to get him back to Spartan, let's go to the hospital to see him. And I just remember getting off the elevator. Trav was kind of in the, outside the door, kind of waiting for me. And I remember as I'm inching closer to that room, I see just these shriveled legs. Remember my last image of Jeremy was the runner, the athlete, the mountain climber, and now just these shriveled bones that essentially, and I didn't even see his face. I kind of how Trav said, how your knees just kind of, you want to give out. And I didn't fall on the floor, but I wanted to, because I could not believe what I was looking at. A guy who was emaciated, battling, hovering really between life and death still. And that was my first glimpse. And then not long after me being there, I remember his coach from high school, Coach Fry, walking into the room and just, what do you say except cry? And just cry. So, by God's providence, having the size family we do, where you have a sister, we were a team. I mean, we so had to hold on to each other in these dark moments. And then eventually Jeremy did get the ticket to go to Charlotte Restorative. And it's interesting because when he went there, they had a brain injury center, and he kind of went back to default of just, he wasn't responding. And we're thinking, Trav and them did all those exercises, and now are we back to square one? It kind of seemed like that. You would walk in there and Jeremy would just kind of the 1,000-mile stare. I mean, he's just staring through you, through the roof. I mean, no stimulus, no response. And so a lot of hours sitting by his bed, a lot of commutes up to Charlotte. Well, we planned a day where Scott and Ryan and myself would all go see Jeremy. And again, this was the first time all four of us since the accident in July had went to see him. This is so we're all there. I remember me and Scott walking with canes up to go see him, and we just get in his room, and again Jeremy is just silent, looking off, and I just remember Scott, and at this time he had a neck brace on. I just remember him. Just all he did was just sit by Jeremy's bed. I just remember him extending his scarred arm and just putting it on Jeremy's shoulder. And just, there's no words. It's presence. And then it was soon where we just all of a sudden heard Jeremy start breathing loudly and struggling as if he wanted to say something. And this is what we heard. Hi, Scott. And we were stunned. We couldn't believe what we were hearing. And you kind of wish we would have had an iPhone to record that, but I think it was almost too holy. It was, you can't record this, a God thing. And I just think we just believe that was Jeremy's way of telling Scott, hey, it's not your fault. I forgive you. don't harbor this. Go live your life. Like, I'm okay. God's got me. And that was the last time Jeremy has said a word in almost 15 years.
Yeah, the one and only.
Yeah, the one and only.
Wow. Well, and then, so at this point, now Jeremy's about set to then the family's set to make a decision for what happens next with Jeremy. There'd be plenty of people at that point, the level of care he would need, plenty of people, and there's no judgment here, would just say, we have to put him in a facility. I mean, there'd just be, the capacity to take that on. But, our dad, just firmly he's coming home. He's coming home. There was no other option. He's coming home. And Dad,
against much opposition. Okay, I mean, there were people that were like, no, this is not a good idea.
And see, I was in St. Louis, so I probably missed a lot of hearing some of that stuff. But yeah, no, it was. So Dad sort of just stood up, planted the flag, and here we go, And so from there, we'll talk a little about this together. He then, so this is like November of 2009 was the timeline of, so again, the accident was what, July 09?
July of 09.
Okay, so this is several months later now, he's set now to go home. So November of 09, and then the next year, now you would have been around Jeremy a lot more and all that living here locally, but for basically the next year, I would describe it as Jeremy is with us, he's living, he's alive. We're super glad he's here. Dad's doing all of his care, which you can't imagine all that. But there's really we got some responsiveness in the rehab to where he could eye track and stuff like that, but that is it. I mean, I would describe Jeremy as almost in a way like kind of furniture in the room in terms of like any interaction. So, I mean, do you remember that? Like that year of just like he's there. But that's really it.
Yeah. Yeah, because after that one word, it's back to square one. I mean, just the 1,000-yard stare, and was breathing, but was not tracking, was not engaging to stimulus, the fingers over the eyes. I mean, nothing. Yeah.
Yep. So this is going to be a theme. You have already touched on this, and it kind of gave me chills thinking back. There's moments now we're having realizations, but I have thought of this, but I hadn't thought of it in terms of what you described with your friend Scott, but how when God did something miraculous or just mind-blowing, holy, these things that you described, he saved these gifts for people to be together and experience together. Because that was a profound moment, you guys and what you all needed together that no one else got to see. You guys needed that together. Yep. You were the ones in the wreck. But then coming out of that, our family, a big family, we're in St. Louis, so Christmases were, common to get together. So it's the following Christmas. So this is December 2010. So basically a year away from Jeremy coming home since then. And we're all hanging out, and I think, you can recollect, we were playing, I think, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, doing some other stuff, whatever. And we're reading clues off, and you could see something turned on in Jeremy's face. Like he knew an answer or something. I just remember the eyes that were kind of like glazed were alive. They were like he was there. You could just tell it in his face. Do you remember any of that?
Yeah. Well, and get to the good part. Yeah.
So, and you might have a different good part. I mean, what I guess I remember on that instance was someone, brothers telling jokes and inside jokes and things, and he started laughing.
Right,
Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it was something was kindled in him, and then we hear crystal clear as we're all in the living room, we hear Jeremy's voice again, but it wasn't words. It was a laugh.
Wow. Yeah. Well, it was just those moments are things that you only can imagine.
Yep.
But in the moment, you're just like, you almost draw up.
Yep.
So timeline again here. So that was like a gift where we were all together, gathered as witnesses to see that. Then another year passes basically. So Jeremy would have probably been, in a way, then we all knew he's there. He's engaging in ways, but very minimally, there's still no interaction really. He's got no voice at all. He's got really nothing that's where he's contributing in any way to anything. But we're all gathered another Christmas, beginning part of January of 2011. My sister Steph, who's a teacher, we sort of noticed that there's something like you can see like he's moving his left foot, and he's also moving just parts of his body that, like, if he laughs or a joke's funny or he's affirming something in his way, movement's happening. And I think with Steph that, she's smart, providentially, maybe God planted this for her, but just basically like, I wonder if he could spell. And I love this too. Here's a teacher. I mean, it's just the right situation. I mean, here it is. Grabs like a whiteboard or something, and like literally manually starts to just go through the alphabet. And as he moves his left foot, and lo and behold, he's spelling stuff. And we're just like, oh my gosh. I mean, he can now talk through spelling. But again, we were witnesses. God didn't unlock that or give us that gift of Jeremy's recovery until we were all together again. And in his timing. I mean, why couldn't it have been another year? Why?
Yeah.
You have any remembrance of that?
Absolute gift. And I just remember, just the elation of because again, what Trav was saying about the diffuse axial brain injury, it was, I mean, all we had heard from surgeons and brain injury specialists is he's a vegetable. Yeah. I mean, there's absolutely no chance of any of this going to take place. So that's the backdrop. Right. So like when you can imagine when we hear the laughter and then you see the finger and there's something happening. I mean, boy, I mean, it's hard to put into words.
It is. And I think looking back even to the present day, like I try to remind myself of this sometimes. It's like, to your point, Jeremy shouldn't be here. The one surgeon, he's within hours of brain death. 2, like you said, the outcome of that specific, he was the lowest grade on the Glasgow coma scale. It's 3 to 15. He was a 3. I looked this up. It's the lowest there is. He should not have gone past vegetative. I mean, you can live, but you can't. And so let's fast forward now and kind of land this of sort of his story and Dan's story, but, and kind of the road to recovery. But, at some point, my sister, you can imagine being Jeremy, where now your friends from high school, college now are moving on, graduating, getting married. Life is completely moving on for everyone else. If you're trapped in your body and you have all these severe limitations, your life seems you're sitting still. Life is still. Life is dark. It's all the stuff. Steph asked him one time, Jeremy, you have so much joy. How do you have this joy? We don't understand it. And he chose in that moment to spell one word. It was Jesus. One word. And I want you to say, and then at some point, Dan had this profound line that, and I want you to say this, Dan, but basically, you conceptualize it this way, that there was something in this recovery that we were thinking maybe God would restore. Do you know what I'm talking about? You said maybe it would be. So can you give us that line of basically what you said?
Yeah. We had all kind of, whether we said it out loud or not, brainstormed within our own minds of like, what do we wish Jeremy could get back? His running, his ability to talk, his ability to walk, what is it? And God did bring back one thing that to this day just shines brightly. He brought back and restored Jeremy's joy. And joy in a circumstance that isn't even allowed. But here we have a brother who is laughing amidst his limitations, amidst just absolute trial, and God gave his joy back.
Right.
And that reminds me, Trav, as Jeremy begins spelling more sentences, I asked him, and this is maybe 2 years maybe after the accident, but I said, Jeremy, do you remember the accident? and he's moving his leg. Okay, which means, okay, yeah, he does. Could you spell out what you saw? And he spelled out these words: nails, thorns, Jesus was awesome.
Wow.
The exact same thing that I had seen.
Wow.
July 21st, 2009. The image of Christ. That's what Jeremy spelled out.
Jeez.
Nails, thorns.
The same
Jesus
image.
was awesome. So, yeah, spellbound, right?
It's hard to even know what to say after that. There is another line that just captures exactly this by the writer Timothy Radcliffe, who says, sort of in the picture of joy for the Christian. A Christian joy is able to hold sorrow within itself because it is living the story of Christ, which runs from baptism to resurrection, embracing Good Friday as a moment in the journey. The authority of the story will be a joy that is larger than the present, and so which can endure its contradiction. That's exactly it. The thorns are there too. The tombstone is placed. The Good Friday, the darkness comes down. But it's not over. So
Good.
the kind of where we're going to kind of end this podcast episode is Jeremy, and we're back to Jeremy's recovery and story. And so we both talked about so far some with Dad, but Dad was a hero in this in so many ways. So from basically 2009 until I could be wrong here. I want maybe 8 years. Was it somewhere in there? Eight.
Yeah.
Eight to 9 years. We're gonna say
reasonable. Yeah.
Dad basically carried almost all of the care for Jeremy on his back. I mean, at some point in there were some shift workers and help, and I don't want to also over glamorize that. That's even a great because it comes with a cost, and it certainly came with a cost for the family in ways, but on the beautiful side of laying a life down, that is what he did for his son.
Yeah, I love that, Trav. And, one thing that's really interesting that I can now fully kind of realize, and looking back, both Trav and I help serve in the care team from time to time, doing Jeremy's care. And now it's very streamlined. There's been years of perfecting almost the craft of caring for Jeremy. But one of the things that just is mind-boggling is how Dad had to learn all of that on the fly. I mean, here we have a farmer, a handyman who is now tasked with the burden of caring for a human being so they don't get bed sores, so they stay out of the hospital, they stay healthy. And for him to trial and error to figure out care
right
is just, it's profound.
And that's I'm glad you said that too, and we've still seen this to this day, is that the complexity of Jeremy's brain injury, and some of it's being really proactive with trying to get services again, but so much of this feels like even to this day, you're alone still. You don't have all of these continued going back and rechecking brain scans and prognosis. And it from there on out, it just feels like it. Yes, you have doctors that try to do their best to help, but it's still, so much of this is on your own. To this day it is. And so that makes it even more impressive of just learning on the fly and then basically creating routines and structures and equipment. I mean, Dad, was this innovative guy that could fix anything on the farm. And we still to this day have a certain thick pad he made for Jeremy in his bed that is designed in a way that holds him a certain way. He created something that kind of holds and contains his feeding tube, his peg tube, that we've even had doctors go who thought of that? I mean, this day, we have that stuff.
Yeah. And there's still images in my mind etched of when I lived in Cowpens at the time, before I got married and Dad's doing this care. I mean, there would be mornings at 5 a.m. where there's a little bitty light on in Jeremy's room, and here Dad's feeding him and giving his medications. I mean, at 5 a.m. alone. I mean, I'm just, it's just such a reflection of like a father and a son, and just, at its finest of laying down your life.
Yeah, you're right. And I think too, like the fact that Jeremy is still being cared for with incredible care through people, that's the legacy that Dad said, we're going to do this. He's not going to a facility. We are going to do this. And so this, we would say this probably shortcutted Dad's life. We lost him 2 years ago in May. Yep. Dad passed away. He had, late onset dementia, and I know probably some of that with the stress of this, with all of that, kind of probably heightened or sped up, even getting dementia as bad as he did. And so he truly did lay his life down for that. And at the end of the day, I mean,
Trav, could you, I know this is maybe we could save this for the next episode, but just that scene that could you maybe just talk about that day when Dad passed into glory? Yeah. What happened? What was so special about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, and this is, it's like, you talk about holy moments that, so, Dad then, the last probably 3 years of his life, or so, where just dementia just kept accelerating, getting worse and worse, and to the point where he had really even lost the ability to communicate. Now he's getting basically what looks like Jeremy's care in many ways, in a way. I mean, he needs help getting fed, all of the same things he was doing for his son. And Dad was nearing the end. All the signs, he was in hospice for over a year, but he was nearing the end, and it was hard for me to just give up on just feeding him, and anyway.
And
go ahead.
Trav had this idea of, it's so wow. He had the idea of let's bring Dad to Jeremy's house, and let's put their beds together. Right next to each other. Not thinking anything of it except, hey, this would be a great thing. Yep. Little did we know that the next day that Dad would pass. Yep. And we have this picture of 2 medical beds next to each other, Dad and Jeremy.
It's crazy. It felt, looking back, like, I mean, you had this, I think, pull to like also go over to Jeremy with Dad's on that Saturday before he passed. I had that like idea, like, let's bring Dad with Jeremy. No idea why. I mean, I didn't know it was imminent. We knew he's probably getting there, but I had no sense. We're down to like hours here. So that Sunday, and also our sister Steph had this, kind of prompting in her to like come visit, Dad. And I'll never forget, right before we kind of get to what Dan was kind of asking me about, but that last sort of morning of Dad's life, he still got to spend time outside in his wheelchair. And I'll never forget that God gave him that gift of being outside. That's what he loved. He was out there. So fast forward a couple hours now, he's back into his room, and Dad, for the last, I think, year of his life, was in Jeremy's old wheelchair. Because you can have the regular type of wheelchairs, but Jeremy's got kind of a medical chair that's souped up. And even though this one was older, it had all these adjustments, and it was, you could do so much with it. So Dad then is in Jeremy's wheelchair for probably the last year of his life or so, when he couldn't walk anymore. And I had left, and, I was on the phone, actually, with my brother Ryan, and I came back into Dad's room, and his face was down, and there was kind of some saliva kind of running down his mouth. And, I feel like right then and there, I think Dad had passed. As I'm in the threshold of the room, I walk in, and, it's that surreal moment. I'm trying to do vitals, and I can't, I'm giving as many and I'm just, I think Dad. In the background of the music going on was the song, "It Is Well With My Soul." So that is what ushered him into heaven. And he left this earth in the last place he left was sitting in Jeremy's wheelchair. The chair he had pushed, the chair he had
fixed.
The
chair he had.
It was almost like a chariot that he then wrote. And God, how fitting, God sending you, this is the vehicle that you last occupied. So a little bit more of just kind of ending this with Jeremy and his story and Kara's, and then, so Dad had several years left of his life, where he was living with us and we were caring for him. But the care was transitioned on to my youngest brother, Brett, and his wife, Heidi, and they oversaw Jeremy's care and took what Dad had started and then grew it and built a system and a team and just really did an incredible job to build it into really what it is today, of just rotational staff and care and a binder with all kinds of like incredible like information for medical stuff. And anyway, so that was kind of then, and they gave their life to that for a few years, and then have moved on to their next chapter, and they're in Athens. And then we have some family friends, one who was Jeremy's caregiver and has loved him tremendously and has been like a sister. Iran and Deborah Benjamin are now living with Jeremy. And that's...
one of my favorite kind of stories of Iran. Iran, just a huge, imposing, linebacker for the Bears, And when Jeremy has to get weighed, like that's kind of complicated with a wheelchair. And at one point, Iran would lift Jeremy up just with his arms and just get on a scale. And you just can't make it up. It's just, again, a picture of serving, laying down your life for somebody else.
Wow. Well, I'm going to take us out with, and if you have any other closing final thought, Dan, but I'm going to take us out with what I believe is a fitting quote that really summarizes what, because yes, this is a dramatic story, a hugely dramatic story of God in the story of Dan and Jeremy and the recovery and all of this stuff. But God is in all of our stories in this way. Sometimes it doesn't look as dramatic, but he is there just as much and working in the tiniest things that we may not see. And there's a Spanish priest who describes what it looks like to kind of, this to me summarizes what we've kind of talked about in a profound way. But he says that if I am certain of this presence, Jesus, that invades life, I can face any circumstance, any wound, any objection, any repercussion, any attack, because all this opens me up to awaiting the mystery that will become present, to suggest the path to me, to accompany me, even in entering darkness, according to a design that is not mine. There's some kind of profound mystery of a design that was not yours, a design that was not Jeremy's, but somehow there's some mystery in that. Thanks for listening to the podcast today and hanging with us in this conversation. We're going to have a part 2 coming up where we're going to really talk about this paradox of Jeremy's voice, how he was essentially voiceless, and yet God has used an inaudible voice to be amplified in such a way that it has much more reach and strength and impact than our voices. Some really cool stories of how that's transpired through the years, and then up to the present and future of where things are with Jeremy and his story. So be sure to check that out. Also be sure and check out Jeremy's website, joyindespair.com. We have a link for that in the show notes. A lot of cool stuff on there and ways to connect with Jeremy. We'll talk more about that website in the next episode as we talk about his story. I hope this episode has helped you see your life in new ways, maybe think, contemplate, and see and feel God's presence in maybe even ways you haven't considered, and are encouraged in that now and going forward. Have an awesome day.